film and TV and commercials. And the purpose of VME is to connect veterans, and then to each other, and also to sometimes jobs or internships or mentorships. And we love to have events like this where we can help educate by having wonderful people like you, David, come in to speak and share your immense experience and knowledge with us, so we can just glean those jewels and then have a much better career than we would have without those things that took you so long to learn, that you give to us freely. So that's the purpose of VME, and we have over 4,300 members right now. It climbs every day and month. We get more, and we've had a ton of these Zoom meetings since the pandemic began. Normally we're in person, but it is very convenient to not have to battle traffic, I gotta say, with these Zoom meetings. So.
Yeah.
But I suppose we'll eventually go back to in person. So let's go ahead and give a shout out to the services. I know we're gonna have more people coming in, but let's see. Let's start with the Space Force, just to see if we have anybody. Do we have anybody on here from Space Force? Oh, we got somebody in Burbank though. Hello, but not from Space Force. But I'm in Burbank, so I just noticed that. Okay, we'll move on then. How about Marines? Where are the Marines? We get a shout out from you guys. Marines, type in the chat since you can't talk. Okay, we got it wrong. How's that? Alexander, howdy. Joel, hello. Oh yeah, Justice, hey. Justice. Okay, how about our Navy friends like me? Woohoo! Any Navy in the house?
Yep.
All right, go Navy. Yes, Dave, Brenda, Rick.
Navy picture.
Oh yeah, he's got his
go.
Go Navy. Okay, and then moving on, we have any Coast Guard here? Little brothers of the Navy? Just kidding. You guys are valid in your own right. All right, Coastie. And is that it? Is that all for Coast Guard? Okay, and then last but not least, we've got the Army. Army, okay, everybody was rating that. Oh, we got tons of who-ahs here. Okay, we've got Andrew, we've got Sydney, we got Brian, we got Ken, we've got Jamie, we've got Chemo, Barbara, woohoo! Okay, all right, Army. Well, and then now, Rick, we're joining together with your wonderful podcast, and why don't you explain what it is you've been doing, and then introduce our illustrious speaker we have tonight.
Yeah, I'm just started a Zoom community called Inspiring Artists, just to kind of give back to, I guess, mainly writers, but also anyone else in the industry that's, looking to connect and with working writers and working professionals, just to make it a little bit easier to navigate and also to make friends. That's basically it. Cool. So we got David Morrell today, and then in 2 weeks I have what was his name?
Well, that's okay. Tell us about David.
All right.
Make it go to
Thanks. So David Morrell today, who's joining us, is a New York Times bestseller of over 30 novels and the author of First Blood, the novel in which Rambo was created. He has a PhD in American literature from Penn State and was a professor in the English department at the University of Iowa for many years. In addition to First Blood, he also had his classic espionage novel, The Brotherhood of the Rose, which I own.
Excellent.
Turned into a miniseries, the only one to ever be broadcast after a Super Bowl. His latest novels are the Victorian mystery thrillers Murder as a Fine Art, Inspector of the Dead, and Ruler of the Night. And anyone looking to expand into novel writing, his writing book, The Successful Novelist, describes what he has learned in his 5-decade career, which is available through Amazon and other retailers, which I highly recommend. So thanks for joining us, David. We really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a bit of a shock to hear somebody refer to a 5-decade career, but it is. A half century, it's hard for me to believe that I've been a published writer that long.
Yeah, and and I own 20 of those novels.
God bless you.
Yeah, and I just finished, for the first time, I just finished the First Blood novel, which we'll be talking about in depth, because most of the people that had questions obviously referred to that novel. Rambo had to do with a Vietnam vet with PTSD, and VME being a military organization. Do you have any connections to the military through your parents or siblings, grandparents?
Well, but my defining moment involves my father. I'm from Canada originally. I'm an American citizen now, but I was raised in Canada. And my father was a British aviator during World War II.
Oh, wow.
He came to Canada to train Canadian flyers to enter the war. So, near as I can tell, this is in Southern Ontario. He arrived sometime in 42. He met my mother, got married. I was born in 43, and then he was recalled. And he was, at the time would have been a harrowing part of the military. He was in the Navy, but he was a flyer.
Yeah.
And his profession was as a forward observer, which meant that his aircraft, there would have been more than one in the aircraft, flew over positions that were being bombarded by Navy ships on D-Day. And he was shot down, the aircraft was shot down on the second day of D-Day. And my mother, it's funny how, certain things as we're young stick with us, but I was raised to believe that my father had died in combat, that he had died when he was shot down. And I had this fantasy that it had not happened and that one day he would walk in the door. So when I was perhaps 23 years old, my mother one day, speaking casually, said, "Oh, that reminds me of something that George wrote to me after he was shot down." And so naturally, I became quite alert. And what she told me then was that he had been found by the French underground. He had been, I have no idea how, gotten out of France, gotten to England in a military hospital where he died, as my mother said, and all of this is, in the family. My mother said that there wasn't a ready amount of antibiotics to treat whatever it was that was wrong with him. So I grew up haunted by a father I didn't know anything about, and that I found out had lived but died. So it was all very traumatic.
Yeah.
So in a way, I'm hardwired to think about the military. And it's interesting to me that many years later, I became a private pilot. And it was only later that I understood that in some weird way, subconsciously, I was perhaps connecting with a father I never knew. And this theme is just all through my fiction. And one of the things I encourage people to do is, pay attention to those subconscious things that are jabbing at them, because that's really the interesting things they have to write about.
Yeah. Yeah, mine's seems to be my daughter. Just the relationship that her and I have seems to wiggle its way into everything I've written so far.
Yeah.
I know it was a long time ago, but I'm sorry for your loss.
Well, thank you. It certainly was. I never got over it. Being raised as the single mother at a time when there was no social services to speak of.
Yeah.
And I was very young, and my mother would sometimes take me to other places where there was this man hanging around the family. And I wondered, who the heck is that guy? Because I took for granted that families were a single mother and a child.
Yeah.
And it was really took me a long time to adjust to the idea of what the conventional notion of a family is.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a fascinating story, though, as well as having the French underground get him out and back to England, and there's just so many layers of all the things that were going on during the war.
Exactly, and I wish I knew more, but my mother eventually remarried to somebody who didn't like children, and that's a whole other story about what that situation was like. But she destroyed everything to do with my birth father.
Mm.
I did find, I don't know how they survived. I do have a picture of him in front of an aircraft. And a few other pictures of him with her in Southern Ontario, but it's all very ghostly. I once wrote a novel about photography, about a thriller about a photographer, and I did it because I've always associated photographs with death.
Yeah.
And that photographs freeze time. And when we look at a photo, we always say, oh, look at what it was like then. You know,
Yeah.
how young somebody was, or that tree, look at how small it was then, or look at that house where we used to live, or that apartment, or what have you. And that sense of time haunts photographs as, I guess, something maybe that I picked up from these ghostly photographs that somehow my mother didn't destroy. I have no idea why she didn't.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about my birth father's relatives. You know, that's a whole mystery over there. My mother said vaguely, oh, they were all killed in the Blitz, which was, I'm assuming with a military audience here, that you're aware, people are aware that that was when the Germans bombed major portions of England during the war. And you know, I don't know if they lived in London or wherever, or if she was lying to me. I grew up in a lot of lies,
Yeah.
which is maybe a good thing for a writer, a novelist to have.
Yeah.
How did you get your start in writing? Did you always do it as a child, or it was something you thought you wanted to do later?
No, I think I was hardwired. And since this is a writers group with also military connections, whenever I teach at conferences, I always start with a quote from Graham Greene: "An unhappy childhood is a gold mine for a writer." And everything I've ever written about comes out of the traumas and confusion I had when I was very young.
Yeah.
My mother could not support me and earn a living. She was a master seamstress. She could handle a sewing machine like concert geniuses play the piano. It was wonderful to see her.
Yeah.
But she couldn't do that and watch me. So she was forced to put me in an orphanage. I was in an orphanage, I think it was for a year. She said it was shorter, but it was, for me, it was very long. And, you know, one of the hardest things for a writer is to sit by yourself and be alone. I was hardwired to do that.
Mm.
I mean, I'm an only child, and I called it doing time in the orphanage.
Yeah.
And then my father or my mother remarried. The stepfather did not like children, and they fought. And this is where the storytelling comes in. I had never seen a prison movie, but you know how in these movies, when they're about to break out, they stuff pillows and things under the blankets.
Yeah.
Well, my stepfather, and my mother argued a lot. And I grew up in a state of fear. So when I was 4 years, 5 years, 6 years old, I fixed the bed and put the pillow there. And then because I was afraid. So I crawled under the bed, and that's where I slept. And when I was under the bed, I told stories to myself. And the stories I told, I was not a victim. I was the hero rescuing other people. And I often, I tell, I'm old enough to have grandchildren, I tell them life is binary, and some of the choices you have are you can be the victim of your life story or you can be the hero of your life story. And I was determined to, I mean, I knew this wasn't right, so I was going to get out of it somehow. So I told stories to myself, and I always wanted to tell stories as a consequence. And so it started when I was very young.
Did you start writing them down at that time, or
No,
you just?
I did not. I was very confused to the point that the principal of my high school said that he actually called me into his office, and I remember him looking at me and saying, "You'll never amount to anything."
Hmm.
And the reason he was saying that is he had heard that I was watching television from when I went home at night until, in those days, in the Stone Age, television went off at 12 o'clock. It stopped, or 1 o'clock in some regions, and the national anthem played, and then there was a test pattern. And I stayed up. That's how much I wanted to escape. I stayed up and watched television until it went off the air, except I wouldn't watch the news because I was convinced that in the middle of the broadcast, someone would come on and say, war has just been declared. And that was a trauma for me. I could not watch television news until maybe the end of grade school. Yeah. Because I associated it with the death of my father, whom I never knew, but I desperately wished for. So it was all very complicated, and what saved my life really was a television show called Route 66. That again, I'm older than I look. This was in 1960, and I was 17. And this show was about two young men in a Corvette convertible driving across the United States. Remember, I'm in Canada watching this, yeah, in search of America and in search of themselves. And the show was filmed on location wherever those young men drove. It wasn't a reality show, there were scripts. Yeah. There were stories which had an amazing amount of action and ideas combined. And over time, I learned that the same man wrote almost every script. His name is very distinctive, Sterling Silliphant. Hmm. And and those of you who are screenwriters, if you're not aware of Sterling's legacy, you should be, because at one time he was the highest paid screenwriter in the 70s. No one made more money than he did. And he had an Oscar for In the Heat of the Night. He was the king of, he laughed about this, he was the king of disaster movies. He wrote The Poseidon Adventure, he wrote The Towering Inferno, and then, God help him, he wrote The Swarm. And as he said, who do I have to blank, blank, blank to get off this picture? And I was so enamored of these scripts. The power of writing is really the theme here. Yeah. That at the age of 17, I could not type. I wrote a hand letter. And at the end of every episode, it said, this has been a Screen Gems production. So I'm thinking, all right, Route 66 Screen Gems, there's something here. And I went to my local library, and to this day, librarians are some of my favorite people. So I went to the librarian and I said, how do I get in touch with Screen Gems? And I didn't believe it was possible. And she just grinned at me and went away and came back with the address. I sent the letter to Sterling, and Sterling wrote back within a week. A two-page single-spaced letter.
That's amazing.
It is. And what it came down to, it was very long. He said, "Dear Mr. Morrell," and he knew I was only 17. He said, "Dear Mr. Morrell, I'm so sorry I took so long to respond to your letter. But I was out at sea on a boat at the time your letter arrived." And where we get down to the bottom of it, and he says, "I can't read your material for obvious reasons, God help him, I'm 17. But he said, this is how it's done. If you're meant to be a writer, you write and 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 write. And then you find other people who are interested in writing, which is one reason why I agree to do conversations like this, because I'm passing on what Sterling did for me.
Yeah.
And he said, you will meet other people who are interested in writing, and you will learn from them, or at least get enthusiasm from being with them. And then you'll write and write and write and write. And one day, if you have something to say, someone of influence will find you and help you. And he said that it is that terribly simple and that terribly difficult.
Was that your
And
mentor,
so,
Philip Klass?
pardon me?
Was that your mentor, Philip Klass?
No, that was Sterling Silliphant, but then I later found someone else. So I set off on my voyage, and to leap far ahead, Sterling and I eventually became very close. Almost, the secret to my life is the father-son dynamic. And Sterling became like a father to me. And when you mentioned Brotherhood of the Rose, when it was the only miniseries, was NBC after a Super Bowl, 33 million people watched that. And Sterling Silliphant was the executive producer. So he and I not only became fast friends, but we also got to work together. And so, the closing of that world was really meaningful to me. So I set out I told him I want to be you. Which isn't to say I wanted to imitate him, because nobody is a success if you're imitating. But his approach to life, he was a traveling salesman, and he was always moving forward as a consequence. And when Route 66 was on the air, he stayed in a car 5 weeks ahead of the production, as if he were one of the characters. And he came into a town, met with the CBS affiliate. It was a CBS show. They showed him the town. And then he went to a motel and wrote a script in 3 days. Oh. And then sent it on. And he did this for 4 years, while he was also writing for other television shows, including Naked City. Oh. There's never been a career like it. And today we have, and I don't mean to knock, and I won't name anybody. There are people who are well known for having done a lot of shows, written them, but many of them have a writer's room. Yeah. Sterling did not have a writer's room. Sterling was a guy in a room writing. And when at the end of his career, the Writers Guild had to redo the primitive computers at the time, but had to redo its entire system for retirees, because nobody had ever made that much money as a writer in the Writers Guild. Yeah. He was really cool. I learned from him, you got to keep moving forward. You got to change and just keep testing. And that's what Route 66 did for me. And it's available on DVD. So if anybody ever wants to look at it, it's there.
Oh, great.
That's a good plug for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you went to Penn State, did you know you wanted to be a novelist, or were you thinking screenwriting?
When my goal would have been to work in movies and television.
Okay. To
be Sterling. And Sterling had a show that that was maybe coming up, and we exchanged a lot of letters as I progressed, and I kept writing to him, and he would answer. And there was a possibility that a series, I think it was called, now I won't be able to remember it, Mayday. It was a military thing. I think it was going to be about the Coast Guard and emergencies in the Coast Guard. And he told me, and we occasionally I'd phone him, and he said to me, if this series go, I'll hire you as a very low, but that'll be a way for you to move up and try to learn. But the series didn't go. Mm. And by then, I'm in Canada at a small college. So how am I gonna, how do you how do you get into that industry? And so I gradually understood that if I was ever going to get into the movie world, that I would have to do it through fiction. And then, so as a consequence, everybody was shocked because I went to college and I got a BA. And then because I realized how hard it was to earn a living as a writer, I then decided to go into grad school, and that's how I wound up at Penn State, and I got a master's and a doctorate there. And by then I was in the book world. So, that fork in the road had, I'd taken that road that I was in the book world.
Yeah. How many novels did you write before you got to First Blood, or was that your first?
That was it.
Wow. And how did that come about that it was then optioned as a film?
Well, that's an adventure in itself. But lest we not mention him, at Penn State, there was a professional writer named, his real name was Philip Klass, but his pen name was William Tenn. He was a science fiction writer who'd been a big deal in the 50s during the golden age of that genre. And Penn State had done this really weird thing. They had hired a professional writer to teach writing. I mean, that almost never happens. I mean, how wild is that? Yeah. And he and I approached him and I said, I don't know how to do this. I need help, but something about me must have spoken to him. And he actually gave me a test. He said, give me a short story a week. And I was going to grad school. I mean, I'm taking classes, I'm married, I have a very young child, and, I got to earn a living. I got to get out of here and teach or do something. And he said, write me a short story a week. Well, the thing about work is, if it's only work, here we go. So I wrote a short story a week. And he didn't, if he read them, he didn't tell me. I just, every Friday or whenever, I'd turn in this short story. And finally he called me into his office and obviously it was a test. Would I get with the regiment? Finally, he looked at me and he said, please stop, you're terrible. And I was, because I was writing bad James Joyce, because I was in the university environment. And I was, I'd forgotten Route 66. I'd forgotten Sterling. And he introduced me to a British thriller writer named Geoffrey Household. It's the British spelling, Geoffrey. And Household had written a book called Rogue, Rogue, Male, Male, about a British big game hunter who stalks Hitler on the eve of the Second World War. The book was published in 1939, and very, and the wonderful thing about the book, it's a great idea. The big game hunter gets caught on the first page. And the story is about what happens after that and what the Nazis do to him. And it's just a wonderful book. And I went back to Philip Klass, William Tenn, and I said, you mean you're allowed to write this way? And that was it. And maybe in 2 months, I was writing First Blood. Wow. And it took me 3 years, from 68, 69, 70 into 71, because I was getting my degrees and then I was teaching. But I worked on that sucker for 3 years in many drafts, often thinking I would never be able to finish it because it went in so many different directions. I was teaching myself how to write a novel. And Philip Klass had an agent. And the agent came to Penn State because Philip Klass had bought a house. This first house he'd ever owned. And so the agent, Henry Morrison, and a friend, a client of Henry's, and a friend of Philip Klass named Donald E. Westlake, whom some of you all may recognize as one of the greatest crime writers ever. who under the name of Richard Stark also wrote a series of hard-boiled novels about a thief named Parker. And a lot of movies were made out of his stuff. And Philip Glass said to me, here's my agent, here's one of my good friends, one of the best writers in the business. Go over there on the staircase and tell him about First Blood. He didn't tell me he was going to do this. And so for the first time in my life, I pitched to somebody. And it was on a staircase at a housewarming where people were going up, and there was only one toilet and it was upstairs. So people were going up and down past us as I'm trying to tell this story to this agent and this great writer. And I finished, and I remember the agent looking at Don Westlake and saying, what do you think? And Westlake said, I think it's a hell of a story. And Don and Henry Morrison said, I do too. When you finish, send it to me. And so all of a sudden I had an agent. And so in a way, I was blessed. You know, all the steps were there for me to proceed. But as we all know, you know, you can try and try and try. That doesn't mean it's going to be good for you. So, you know, there's a lot of work there and also a lot of luck.
Yeah.
And as you're discovering, I talk a lot. I don't take short, do short, you know, so bear with me as I.
Oh,
as
I love it.
You know,
No,
I love
like
the
long
stories. And get to so many little tidbits, you know, that would be impossible to ask the question to get to.
Yeah.
So I love it.
I give you a sound bite, it's not the same.
That does. We had some questions that people submitted beforehand, and one person was asking, Joel Searles actually was asking, who were your influences for the Rambo character? And he also wonders that, you know, about the sheriff and the colonel, but how did you first come up with the idea for Rambo, and where did those characters come from?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is, it's a surprise to some people, a Canadian created Rambo.
Yeah.
I didn't become an American citizen until 1993. It's very hard to become a citizen, by the way. You know, there's a whole debate about why don't they just become citizens. It's hard. So it wasn't until I moved to New Mexico that I found the mechanism where I was able to become a citizen. But I was first in the United States as a foreign student, and my wife and our very, very, very little daughter were allowed in with me. And at the border at Windsor, the immigration official quite rightly said, you are a guest in this country. And as you are a guest in a home, you have to behave that way. And so you might have political opinions that you come upon as you go through your stay in this country. Keep them to yourself. And I took that to heart. So in 1968, years ago in England and in Europe in 1848, there was something called the Year of Revolution, in which almost every nation in Europe came close to toppling and did topple in terms of their royal houses because of the revolutions that occurred. In 1968, in the United States, I felt that was going to happen. That was the year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. That was the year that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. That was the year of the riot at the Democratic Convention, in which police and protesters were, for 3 nights, in what amounted to combat outside that convention. That was the year that there were not 10 riots in the United States, or 20, or 50, or 100. There were several hundred riots in the United States. Violent riots of the sort that we saw on January 6th, often citywide. well, that's wrong. It wasn't citywide, but often the inner cities. And to this day, some cities have never recovered. Inner Detroit, inner Gary, Indiana, inner LA, never recovered. And it seemed like every week there was a riot. In fact, there were more than one every week. There were like 4 every week. It's hard to imagine. And I became convinced that the United States was going to topple, that there was going to be a civil war, that the distress that was happening in the civil rights movement and in the anti-war pro faction, that you put all that together, and I didn't see how the Republic could stand, that we were heading toward chaos. And I decided, and I had a moment of one of, when writers have that one moment when they say, yes, I want to write that. And for me, it was an evening, it was at 5:30, I think it would have been about then. Walter Cronkite was then the news presenter on CBS Evening News. And they did 2 stories back to back. They did a firefight in Vietnam, and they did a riot in the United States. And I had this moment where I thought, if you turn down the volume, it's the same story. And this moment came to me, what would happen if a highly skilled operator, I'm getting the word mixed up, highly skilled special operations person from coming back from Vietnam, who was disaffected now. He hated what had happened to him there because he had learned that he was good at killing people. And he was going to set out to go walk across the United States to see what he'd been fighting for. And that was the start of the novel. And I said, well, I need an antagonist. So in a way, Rambo is quite different in a way from the movies, especially the second and third ones. Rambo was like the characters in Route 66 on a quest to find something, to find America and find himself. And he grew his hair long, he grew a beard, and he was, for all anybody could tell, a hippie. The first sentence of the novel says his name was Rambo and he was just some nothing kid, for all anybody knew, standing by the pump of a gas station on the outskirts of Madison, Kentucky. He had long hair, he had a beard and a sleeping bag rolled over his shoulder. And naturally, the police stopped him. Because in 1968, when I started that novel, if you had long hair and a beard, you got stopped. And I grew my mustache at that time. You can see how daring I was. Wasn't prepared to grow the beard. I grew this mustache in 68 just to see, and I'm telling you, it made a difference. I got a lot of hostility. So I needed another character, and that had to be a policeman, a police chief. And he was of another generation. He's old enough to be Rambo's father, unlike the movie where they're brothers, as it were. But in the novel, Teasel is old enough to be Rambo's father. And he was a hero. I hate to use those words in military context. He distinguished himself in the chosen reservoir retreat in Korea. And he is, as it were, an Eisenhower Republican who understands conventional war. And when he comes into contact with Rambo, he hasn't the faintest idea what guerrilla warfare is like. And he figures that if you have a lot of guys going after one guy, it's no problem. He just doesn't grasp it. And the whole point of the story then was to be that when Rambo, and in the novel, he destroys the posse. It's far more than in the movie. that the police chief would say, I get it, Rambo, he's a better fighter, but I'm a better organizer. And that's when he sends for the guy that trained Rambo. And then, so now you have a threesome, as it were, and you have an allegory. You have Rambo right on one side of the political spectrum, Teasel on the other, and Troutman representing the system. And Troutman's first name is Sam. He's Uncle Sam. And, I mean, you can go through the book and just, do it as can diagram it in terms of the thematic implications. And the whole idea was that the viewpoints would alternate, Rambo, Teasel, Rambo, Teasel. When we saw Teasel from Rambo's point of view, we'd say, what a horrid guy. When we saw Rambo, I'm getting it mixed up now, Teasel, you get it. When you see them back and forth, we become sympathetic with the viewpoint character and hate the other guy. But then when we switch viewpoints, we like this guy and we hate that guy. So the whole idea was that there are no winners. And that, that what was happening in the United States, for everybody thought they were right. Nobody sets out to do something that they're doing it for the wrong reasons. But from somebody else's point of view, they're wrong. And so that was the logic of the novel, that they would all go together. I'm sorry that they would be so opposite, but that the end and the climax, they would head on like two trains, and the reader wouldn't know who to cheer for.
Yeah. So getting First Blood made took over 10 years. Several directors,
Yeah.
several actors. First of all, how did it get noticed by Hollywood? And what was the journey finally getting it made 10 years later?
Many writers listening here, watching, have agents. And for those who don't understand the system, writers need agents to represent them, if for no other reason than if they try to represent themselves, they have a fool for a client. You need somebody who's objective, who can look and say, you can maybe make these adjustments in your work, it might be better. And they have contacts the writer does not have in order to sell the material. So my agent, and remember, Donald Westlake was one of his clients and sold many, many books to the movies. And so the initial purchase, well, it wasn't a purchase, it was an option, was by somebody named Stanley Kramer, who in the day was really important. He was known for idea pictures. I mean, he was an Oscar winner, moreover, many times, and a big, big deal. And he agreed to option the book. An option is where they give you a certain amount of money and they have the right for a year or 2 years to develop it, to get a script made in order to try to get the picture made. But if the picture hasn't been made at the end of the option period, the writer, I get to keep the money and I regain rights to the project. And he agreed to option the property and he never delivered a contract. And there were ads in the New York Times, Stanley Kramer options First Blood, never sent a contract, and finally said that he didn't have the money. And so we had lost 6 months. And what happened was that a man named Lawrence Terman, who was one of the producers of The Graduate, found the book. This is so odd how these things happen. Found the book in a bookstore in Beverly Hills and looked at it and read it and thought that this would be, it had so much action. There are few, forgive me for saying this, but it was my purpose. I wanted to see how much action, believable, well-written action I could put into a novel. And as my agent was concerned, it'd never get published because there'd never been anything with that amount of action in it. So naturally, when it got over that hurdle, Larry Terman thought this could be a movie. And he went to a producer, writer, director, whom I deeply admire, named Richard Brooks. And Brooks had done Elmer Gantry, multiple Oscar winner, Elmer Gantry in Cold Blood, A couple of Westerns I really love, The Professionals and Bite the Bullet. And Brooks was hired by Columbia, who purchased the book outright, did an option. So now if whatever happened, I would never get the property back. I had the money and they had the book.
Why did they insist
And
on that? Or was that what your agent
they wanted the book.
Okay.
Sometimes it happens that way. I had a book called Extreme Denial that Michael Douglas bought for a very large amount outright and did nothing with it to this day. And in fact, it's so tangled, nobody even knows who owns the film rights anymore. But yeah, they skipped over the option process and bought it outright. And Richard Brooks worked on it for a year. And for reasons nobody knows, Columbia Pictures decided to sell the property to Warner Brothers. At that time, it was rumored that Paul Newman would play the police chief because, as I said, nobody knew who the hero was. So you could do it so the police chief was the hero, and a lot of it then would depend on your politics. You know, depending on how you view First Blood, your politics is sort of revealed. I heard that. Whether or not it is true, I do not know, but I know for certain that Steve McQueen signed to be Rambo, and that Sidney Pollack, one of my very favorite directors, was signed to direct. And I know this because Sidney told me it himself. But the picture would have been made in 1975, and there were no, Steve McQueen was then in his mid-40s, and there were no mid-40-year-old Vietnam veterans in 1975. You know, these days with Iraq, I was with the USO tour to Iraq in 2010, and I met grandmothers and grandfathers over there who were serving, young, but 55, but they had the weapons, and they had they were in a position of responsibility. There was nothing like that from Vietnam. That was an 18-year-old war. And so they realized that it would be ludicrous for Steve, even though he wanted to do the motorcycle thing, it would be ludicrous for him to be in the movie. So they just all walked away. And then it went through another studio, and then finally a company called Carolco, who had been film distributors in the Orient and wanted to make American movies, found the project, bought it from Warner Brothers, and took the script, that one of 26 that had been prepared, and said, this is the one we want to make. And then they went to Sylvester to see if he wanted to be in it. Now that's a tangled story.
Yeah, probably good for your sanity that you had just outright sold the rights to the book, so you didn't have to keep track of every iteration with renewed hope.
Well, it would have been better for me because if it was an option, every time one of those studios, I would have made more money in the long run. Options are the way to go. Often I have one book, I think I've optioned it 10 times. And I think this is great. Do I ever want them to make it? It probably wouldn't be very good. So I just keep taking the money every 2 years. So it was out of my hands. I thought, well, this is interesting. I have no control over this. And, just watching it unfold. The good news for me was that I was 29 years old when First Blood was published. And if at the age of 29, the hoopla that occurred with Rambo in the 80s had happened, I probably would have been insufferable. I probably would have been the biggest dodo anybody ever saw. But I had 10 years to be seasoned. I had 10 years to teach. I had 10 years to learn about the business. I had other books that were published. And when the movie came out in 82, I can tell you it was more a matter of interest to me rather than, oh, I'm hot shot.
Yeah.
And, you know, I take those 10 years as having saved my personality. I think I would have been just horrible. And I've seen it happen to other people when they have instant success and there's, you know, oh boy, God loves me. Well, no.
What are there some things that particularly strike you about the movie that you would still love to change? Like watching it now, you're
Well,
like, oh, I would change this one thing or these 10 things.
there's only one thing I would change, and I would take out, there are too many expletives in it. There's an awful lot of foul language, which isn't necessary, and I don't know why it's in there. I had a good relationship with the producers, and this is anybody who's a novelist out there, even, you know, you screenwriters, you know, the producer's your enemy, right? I mean, this is, you know, they'll swindle you in any way they possibly can. And that's a good thing to be aware of too, you know, that they may treat you as the greatest thing in the world, but the fact is they're schemers. But I had a good relationship with these two producers, Andrew Vanya and Mario Casar. And Andy, when, as an example, the novel takes place in Kentucky, in the mountains in Kentucky. And they moved, it's so interesting that this American Icon was filmed in British Columbia, again, the Canadian connection. And they decided for monetary reasons to film in Canada, partly because the Canadian dollar was worth about 86 cents against the American dollar. So the American dollar would go far, you know, much farther in Canada. Plus British Columbia and Canada had incentives for people who would film there. Later on, Vancouver would become, like the second Hollywood. But at the time, that was not the case. So there were good reasons for them to film in British Columbia, not to mention it looks great. And but Andy phoned me one day. I mean, imagine a producer phoning an author. This is like insane. I mean, what craziness is this that a producer would actually phone the author of the book that they purchased the thing from? You can see it, my attitude and all this. And he said, we're thinking of translating the setting from Kentucky to the Pacific Northwest. Is there a reason we should not do it? Is there a reason the story will not work if we move it there? And I said, there's no reason whatsoever. And he said, thank you. And, but how smart he was, go to the source and find out if there's going to be trouble. And few producers would ever do that. Anyway, if anybody wants my detailed thoughts on this, again, this is so weird. I recorded a full-length audio commentary for First Blood. Can you imagine? They went to the author and to ask him to comment on a movie based upon his novel. I mean, how crazy is that? And so if you want my detailed notions about book versus movie, that's the way to go. But the simple answer is, I think it's a terrific film. It's not my novel. It interprets Rambo differently. My guy is angry. But in the film, he's a victim. And that's one reason why they couldn't make the movie for 10 years, because the hostility in the character. And they were trying to keep him soft. And the body count in the novel is like, one critic said the novel is war as hell and the film is war as heck. Because it's so tamed down compared to what happens in the novel, where a real local war occurs. But that's okay, because movies are different from books, and what works in a book might not in a film, and vice versa. And the decisions that were made were the right ones. The big change is in the ending, and Rambo dies at the end of the novel. The man who trained him kills him. The system wins. And that a version of that was filmed, only Troutman didn't kill Rambo. Rambo committed suicide. And that version of the film was shown to test audiences, and they did not like that ending. They were really furious. And so Andy and Mario decided to go back to British Columbia and shoot a new ending in which he walks out of the police station. And this was amazing to them because they saw the film as a one-off. Rambo's dead. And now they saved him, and it was a tremendous financial success. And I remember Andy telling me, he said, we had no notion of doing sequels. But the test audiences told us to keep the character alive, and we did. And by God, we got to do all those sequels. So again, you know, it's so funny how all this can happen. So the only thing I would change, you know, understanding the book, the film is what it is, and my book is what it is. And, you know, for consistency, I feel there's too many expletives, and I'm not that kind of person that I objectify language. I just felt enough. We got it. We don't need any more. And that would be the one thing that I would change.
What kind of research did you do for that novel specifically?
Well, we remember I, at the time, was Canadian.
Yeah.
So I've not been in the American military. I've not been in the Canadian military. When I got the idea for the novel, I knew I had to do a lot of research. I had to learn about weapons, and I went to the NRA, who taught me the weaponry. And in those days, it isn't, the NRA then was a more innocent version. It was about teaching people safe handling of firearms and not, you know, amendment rights and things like that. And I had, I was teaching, I was able to afford to go to Penn State in the graduate program because they gave me a stipend if I taught writing. Now, why they knew I would be able to type writing, I have no idea. But so I taught first year what they called rhetoric, but it's just how to write essays. And in '68, there were some students in my class who were hostile, young men, and they lingered after class, and it turned out they were newly returned from Vietnam. And they were, we'll put it politely, confused about how somebody their age was up there telling them how to do things when I should have been in Vietnam doing what they had done. So I then explained to them, I'm a Canadian, I'm married, I have a child. There is no way I could go down and volunteer and they wouldn't take me. It wasn't going to happen. So the tone of the conversation got milder. And after class, they began to tell me what it was like coming back and what it was like for them over there. And it was there that I learned there was no PTSD phrase in those days. That came early 80s. But they had the symptoms. They told me about the nightmares and difficulty sleeping, difficult in relationships, too much alcohol, diving for cover when there was a loud noise, and on and on and on. And Rambo, in a way, became an amalgam of the things they told me in these conversations after class. And then I remembered Audie Murphy. And Audie Murphy in World War II was America's most decorated soldier. Medal of Honor and a lot of other citations. And he had written a book called To Hell and Back, about his experiences in World War II. And he was this short Texan with a baby face. You know, how old was he? 17? Or I mean, I'd have to go and look, but he was pretty young. I mean, I think he lied about his age to get into the military. And but I knew the story because Audie Murphy came back and became a movie actor. He became a Western star, and made a couple of important films, The Undefeated, with Burt Lancaster movie with Gene Simmons, and Red Badge of Courage, ideal for him, of a Civil War, about a young man in the Civil War, directed by John Huston. And he made a lot of modestly budgeted films for Universal. But he suffered from PTSD. And he had nightmares. He had a pistol under his bed. He woke up often shooting. When he was on location, they used to, if he was in a motel somewhere, you know, in a rural location, he'd be shooting the walls, and they'd move the frames, the picture frames around to hide the bullet holes, so that they could get the film finished before the manager started wondering what the hell was happening to his hotel room. He was a very troubled man. At one point, he was on trial for attempted murder because he had a friend of his had a dog trained, and Murphy didn't think that the trainer had done a proper job, and moreover had charged too much. And an argument ensued, and Murphy, who carried a firearm, hit him over the head with the weapon. And he was, I suspect, because of his distinguished status as a veteran, he was not, he did not serve any time for that. One of my favorite stories about Murphy is that two stories, and you know, how to say this and not sound, because today, you know, our relationship with Germany is quite different. But in the day, for some reason, some German journalists came to the set to interview him, and somebody noted that they all looked terrified, and he said, "Yeah, I probably shot a lot of their brothers." And he, on a set, a assistant director had made his female co-star cry. And he went over to the assistant director and said to him, "You make her cry again and I'll kill you." And the assistant director said, "When Audie Murphy said that to you, you believed it." And if you look at the action scenes in his Westerns, he goes into some very, very troubled places during the action scenes. And so I said, Rambo is Audie Murphy. He's as if he were in Vietnam instead of World War II. And he's going to grow a beard, and he's going to grow long hair, and he's going to get arrested. And they're going to, as happened, because the event with the shaving, in the movie, it's not the case, but they're going to cut his hair, and they are going to shave him, actually. But in the event, it came out of a real event in the American Southwest, where a group of hippies were detained for vagrancy and were forcibly shaved, and both their hair and their beards, and then rousted out of town. And I mean, that's the way the world was then. And I thought, all right, what would happen if Audie Murphy came back? He grew a long hair, he grew a beard, and they decided to arrest him, and they're going to shave his beard and his hair. What's Audie going to do? And that was always in my mind when I was writing the book, that Audie was Rambo.
That's fascinating. And you had so many people around you who had such excellent pieces for creating this character. We had some questions, and you know, I don't know if it's the same for all of your novels this way, or if some of them just come out of nowhere, but you know, typically characters are built on things that we know, right? But can you describe your process for creating characters and coming up with their high emotional stakes?
Yes. And again, I'm going to speak for novels, because when you're a screenwriter, you're working for a producer. So you can't always do what I do. In fact, seldom can you. I have 3 rules. One is that the idea for a story, for a novel, must obsess me. It's like I can't not write it. And I used an example, I think earlier, about photography and photographs for me representing death. So I wrote a thriller about a photographer and incorporated all of that as a kind of form of what I called self-psychoanalysis for me to understand myself better through the character. And then the research has to be something that is, I don't write about what I know about, I write about what I want to learn about. So the research has to be something that will make me fuller by the end of the book. And then there has to be something about the way the book is written that has to be different and distinct. And people often wonder what I mean. So I'll give an example of First Blood, that the novel has alternating viewpoints. That is the structure of the book. And I know of no other book that is so strictly adhering to that principle and uses it as a way of saying we all do what we think is right, even though the other person might think we're as wrong as can be. And so those are my principles. And what I do before I start a project is I write a letter to myself. And I start and some of it's schizoid. Sometimes I talk to myself, hey, David, how are you today? Oh, I'm okay, how are you? So what are we here for? Well, I have an idea. Well, what's the idea? Well, it's sort of this. And I try to formulate it as if I'm having a conversation with myself. And these go on for a long time. Some of them are 30 pages, single spaced. And I, first of all, what's the idea? And then the other part of me says, so what? And so now I got to answer the so what? And the other part of me is constantly saying, so what? And I'm always on the defensive with this other part of me. And I'm sure if there are any people with any psychiatrists, know I should be put away. But I find it very useful to bifurcate in that fashion.
I saw you do that.
And so
I saw you do that. I saw you do that in First Blood. Rambo did that, and Cecil did a lot of that.
Yeah. Yes. And I find it very helpful. And after I get the idea, so I'm happy with it, then I say, well, what's the best way to represent the idea? What characters would best represent the point I'm trying to make here? We're not in philosophy here. We're in, we have a theme. And I did a book called Creepers, and the whole idea was that 8 hours would take place in an abandoned hotel in the dark. And that was what I wanted to do. And so I kept saying, okay, how am I going to do this in the dark? How's it going to be interesting? Where will it happen? And so, after a while, you start asking the questions to do with characterization and time. When does this occur and where is it occurring and things like that, until I feel confident enough that I'm able to start the book. And the advantage of this, it's writing. It's not yakking to your friends and then going into the ozone. It's actual writing, and you have a document so that if some terrible thing happens to you or to someone you love and you shut down for a long time, you can come back to the document and in like a couple hours be up to speed again. So in my writing book, The Successful Novelist, this is the one chapter that everybody talks to me about. It's the one thing that they find to be most helpful. I mean, there are other things, but it's really a winner.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I'm going to try that for my next project.
And it's writing, see, because you say, oh, what am I going to write about? And then you go off and, walk the dog or what have you. No, you sit down and you start it. And if you do it as a conversation, if you're script writers, you do it as a conversation. It's amazing how all of this starts to generate some tension and some excitement.
So how in depth is your outlining process? Do you have an actual
I
outline?
don't do any outlines,
Okay.
no outlines at all. That's it. That letter is my outline.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you write anything on sticky notes and stick them around so you have that to go for, or do you just glance back at the letter then as you're in your document, your novel?
I don't, but I have a friend named Melinda Snodgrass, who is a writer for Star Trek, among other, some of the Star Trek series, among other things. And she lives here in Santa Fe, where I live, and I was invited to a event at her house, a cocktail party, and she said, "I want to show you my office." And I went in, and she had this big blackboard, and she had all the sticky notes on it. And that's how TV and movies, when you have a committee, gets written.
Yeah.
And see, I'm a loner. So this was like, I'm looking, I said, holy cow, this is fantastic. Because if you're going to have plot problems, that's where you're going to find them, rather than writing a scene to see where it's going to take you. So increasingly, I have started to think about novels as being like jigsaw puzzles, where you have various parts that have to be assembled in a certain way, but you don't always know how they're going to come together. And this started me with my Victorian mystery thrillers, because those are very complicated plots, as Victorian novels must be. And so I often write scenes that I knew I needed, but I hadn't the faintest idea where they went. And that's not how I normally worked. So I found it very frustrating. But then I said, well, am I growing or am I not? Am I going to do the same thing again and again? So increasingly, I'm working on a Western now, a very ambitious Western. And I have 50 pages that I wrote 3 months ago that I still don't know where they fit. And, I keep saying, I'll get to them yet. And, sometimes I say, oh, God, I hope I get to them. That's a long amount of work, but I don't use the sticky notes, but I'm kind of doing that. I'm thinking more about, I have note cards, and often I'll write down this scene, and I'll put them out this way to see if they make chronological sense. In my earlier novels, which were very linear, I didn't need to do that. But as I moved on, the plots got more complicated, and I had to remember how the heck everything was related to everything else.
Did you usually know the ending before you got started?
Not always. I knew the ending of First Blood, and I knew the sentence. And I knew that it was going to end with Troutman having shot Rambo, jacking the empty shotgun shell out of the shotgun, and it would flip through the air, and Teasel, dying on the ground, would see that shotgun shell flipping, and that would be the end of the book. In some cases, I've known the ending, but not the beginning. In some cases, I've known the beginning. It's all an adventure. Yeah. In a few cases, Creepers, I knew all of it as it came to me. It's one of the rare times when a whole book came to me, bang, like that. And I was able to write it in 3 months because it wasn't, a lot of the challenges weren't there.
Yeah, I saw on IMDb that they're trying to make that one.
Creepers?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been optioned 5 or 6 times since 2005. And I have in my contracts, because I've learned the hard way, that if I sell a property, there's a time limit. And if after 8 years, the picture hasn't been made, the rights revert to me.
Yeah.
But I have to pay back what I was paid. Mm-hmm. It's not a free ride, but I get to redo it again. And at one point, one of the producers, having optioned it for 4 times, said, "What am I doing this for? I'll buy it." And they bought it, but there was a time limit. And eventually it came back to me, and the producer then realized what had happened and actually entered in negotiations again. So it's been a very, very complicated thing. But yes, the answer is that has been ready to go in front of the cameras for 3 years. But for one reason or another, something happened. And then of course the pandemic occurred, and there you go.
Well,
But
hopefully
it
it
was
gets made.
supposed to get shot last summer.
We only
I
have
hope,
about,
Yeah.
we only have about 15 minutes left with you. So
Well,
you guys
I-
who are
I
live
talk
right
and talk,
No,
No,
it's great.
okay.
I just want to say there's a little Q&A panel that people can write
Yeah,
in
let's get
their,
that.
their
Yeah.
questions now. So if you guys
And I'll
have
try to
any,
be shorter.
oh no, this has been amazing. And we had people ask questions ahead of time too when they registered, and so some that we've been asking tonight are ones from that.
Oh, great. Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'd like
but
to
I
ask
just
you
wanted to
one
let them have a
question.
little time to write in their question.
I'd like to ask you one question, just because, like you mentioned earlier, life is about growing, becoming
Yeah.
better, not just a better writer, but as a better person. And as when I'm writing, well, me and you were talking about Westerns. So this new one that I'm working on, this character I've written is I can't say how, but she's like changed me in ways that I can't really explain.
Yeah.
So what book that you've written and what character would you say kind of, who did you grow from the most? Because when we're writing, they kind of take life of themselves. It doesn't feel like we're writing them. It's like,
Well, sometimes they're a struggle, right? I mean, every book's different. Sometimes they arrive, and sometimes, who dealt this mess. But my granddaughter Natalie died in 2009 of a rare bone cancer,
oh, I'm sorry to hear
and
that.
this was especially. I can't even find the word. My son, who was 15 years old, died of the same rare bone cancer in 1987. And only 200 people get this disease each year in the United States. It's not inherited. So this is a cosmic unfairness.
Yeah.
And I was attracted to writing a series of books about a man named Thomas de Quincey, a real man in the Victorian era, who was known as the opium eater because he was an opium addict at a time when nobody understood that. And he had written a memoir called Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which made him famous. And he did a lot of other things, and he invented the word subconscious, and he anticipated Freud's theory of psychoanalysis by a half century. And I wanted to write a thriller about him, a mystery in which he would take all these sophisticated ideas about the mind and try to explain them to Scotland Yard at a time when they were happy to make plaster casts of footprints.
Yeah.
And it just was such a wonderful, wonderful setup. Well, De Quincey had a daughter named Emily, and she was 21. He was 69. I mean, would have been his granddaughter, really, but she was his daughter.
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted to write the series of novels was her. That in her relationship with her father. And sometimes it's right in front of my face and I don't see it. But I started the book not long after Natalie died.
Yeah.
And a bookseller, Barbara Peters, who runs a wonderful store called Poison Pen in Scottsdale, said, and of course, you were channeling Natalie when you wrote Emily.
Yeah.
And she said this to me on stage in front of a whole lot of people, the bottom dropped out of me because I realized that's what I've been doing, and that I was sort of, as it were, the grandfather to Natalie and to Quincy, to his daughter. And anyway, it's a very powerful thing. And she is the glue for those 3 books. I mean, without her, those books would be nothing. And every time I got to one of her scenes, I said, oh boy, I get to write about Emily again. So, it happens.
Yeah. So how do you feel like that's changed you as a person?
Oh, that's a real hard question. Because, I'm trying to be changing all the time. I think what it did is help me adjust to her death.
Yeah.
That I had the sense that in my imagination, at least, she was with me still. And that's what happens with grief. You absorb the beloved dead person and make that person one with you and try to go on and lead our lives for them.
Yeah.
And so that's a complicated answer, but that's what it is.
Yeah, no, I feel you. This guy right here is my brother who passed away in 2018.
Oh,
Can't really see him.
yes, and you're new to the emotion. That emotion.
I've lost 6 people.
Pardon me?
I've lost 6 people in 4 years, and I'm about to lose the 7th person. So,
And
from cancer.
someone pointed out to me, if we'd lived in World War II in Europe or in the Middle Ages, death was so common.
Yeah.
Everybody died around us. For us, it's like an unfamiliar emotion that grief is. I'm so sorry, and with only 2 years, it took. The theory about grief is that you have the grief, and then there's a year and a little scar tissue, and then a year and a little more scar tissue, and after a while, you begin remembering them fondly instead of painfully. But it doesn't go away. In 1987, I think about my son every day.
Yeah.
And 2009, which is very recent, I think about Natalie. But we, as I said, we live, and you might find this helpful. I found it helpful to live my life for other people, for the dead people I love, because they don't have the chance to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually thinking about my grandmother a couple of days ago, and I was like thinking, I want her picture on my daughter's wall, so that at least someone remembers her after I'm gone.
Yes, and in the grief community, there's an expression: to be remembered is to be immortal.
Yeah.
And so when we have the photos, that's what I was saying before about the photos. When we have the photos, I have in our house here, I have photos of my mother as a child and my grandmother as a child hanging on the wall. And it's spiritually, that's just powerful.
Yeah, I found that to be true as well. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions for the next 7 minutes.
We have one that ties in fairly well, actually, with this talk of remembering our loved ones and how that goes on. And kind of isn't that what men of war wanted when they want statues erected for themselves, like to be immortal is to have a statue, but all you really need is to be in the hearts of your loved ones still and remembered. But Alexander wrote, if you could meet anyone alive or dead, who would it be?
It would be Thomas de Quincey. This guy was so smart and influenced so many people. Poe admired Thomas de Quincey and created the mystery story. And then Arthur Conan Doyle admired Poe and created Sherlock Holmes. And that's just one example of the way the train, as it were, that De Quincey created. He was incredibly brilliant and anticipated so many things in our modern world. But on the other hand, he was a dope addict. He's the only, in the day, opium was either an exciter or a depressant. For him, it was an exciter, and he'd be up for like 3 days writing, and then he'd crash. So, I don't recommend anybody drinking or doing drugs, but the only writer, and I was a professor, the only writer I know of that, we can talk about Coleridge and we can talk about Kerouac and what have you. The only writer I know of who did it successfully was Thomas de Quincey, and I don't recommend it, but, for him it worked.
Yeah.
And do you have any, you've given such great advice for aspiring screenwriters, but that was a question that we had that kind of seemed like a nice finale cap. And then, Frick has another question, but any final parting advice, even for network?
Well, the thing about writing screenplays, of course, is that you're by and large work for hire. And I am a member of the Writers Guild. I'm a vested member. I've been since 1980. I have only one little credit for a TV show called Monsters, but I've written a lot of movies. I wrote 4 drafts of Brotherhood of the Rose. And anybody in the business knows how this works. If you're early in the game, you're not going to get the credit. It's as it goes goes down, it's, you know, and it gets so complicated. But I mean, and you in the Writers Guild will know what I'm talking about. I have enough years writing screenplays. I am vested, you know, and that's hard to get.
The dream.
And so it's hard, you know, when you're a work for hire by and large. So what I'm going to say for screenwriters, you know, if you want, you know, to do something on the side and write novels, it would not hurt to study the career of William Goldman, who was not only, I think, our most brilliant screenwriter as document. There may be other better screenwriters, but he knew how to write a reading script. And his novels are just amazing as novels. And to see how he then adapted his own work is, I think, really instructive. And I have a whole shelf of Goldman, both screenplays and novels. But if you want to go over on my side, so to speak, as a novelist, you have to remember that screenplays are visual, but books are multi-sensual. So if you carry over your habit of writing only visually, you're going to have a flat book. And you have to orient your scenes so you take the sense of sight for granted and triangulate them with other senses in the scene so the reader doesn't see. People say, oh, I read your novel, it's like I'm seeing a movie. No, you're feeling a movie. I take the sense of sight for granted, but there's plenty of data. I want people to feel my novels. And I talk about this in The Successful Novelist, if anybody, I'm not trying to sell newspapers, but it might be helpful. For a novelist, it's a different thing. Now you're your own boss. And I have two pieces of advice. Nobody ever had a career being an imitator. Nobody ever had been the second best. The ones who go the distance and have the career are the ones who are unique. So my advice to novel writers is always the same: be a first-rate version of yourself and not a second-rate version of another writer. And this works well for life. And the other is, don't chase the market. You'll always see its backside.
So true.
So I have never, I think I had, of all my 30 novels, I think I wrote maybe 26 of them and then sent them in. I didn't send in outlines. I didn't, I just wrote the book I wanted to write. Now, this is very risky. We don't want our parents to have raised dummies. We don't want to make stupid choices. But when there's a certain parameter, write the book that only you could write. I mean, if people read my books, I like to think that they say that's a Morrell book. Nobody else could have written that. And that's what I encourage people to do. And, at that point, luck takes over. Will the market, don't chase it, but will the market like what you've done or not? And the advantage today is there's ebooks. So you can write what you want. But unfortunately, a lot of ebook writers don't take editing. So, a lot of it's not so good. But if you can get the editing, The Martian was an ebook and became a very successful film. There are many, many books that were written first as ebooks and then became movies. So, excuse me?
The Shack was the same. It was self-published ebook and then became a film.
Yeah. 50 Shades of Grey. Is that what it is? I've never read it. So I've never seen the movie.
That was fan fiction. Wasn't that written as fan fiction for the vampire?
Yeah, but it's still sort of, in the E-realm, if that's sort of what I mean. I mean, not polished at all, but it got picked up. I mean, but when I started, you had to go through the traditional process. But these days, if you have you're saying, by God, I'm going to write a thing about this guy on Mars and he's trapped there, you can write it. And as it turned out, it was a wise thing to do. But so much of this is, I really think writers should have a day job. I mean, I'm blessed that my career has been so successful. I taught for 16 years, but I don't, don't need to have a day job. My writing is the day job. But I think for writers, often it's a good thing to have a day job because you don't write scared. Because you got the money coming in and you're not saying, oh, I got to make money, so I'll write this piece of junk. No, I'll write the best I can and hope that I can do something with it. And, as Sterling Celephant said, you go to conferences, you meet other writers, and there are agents at these conferences. They're not when I started, but now. And, there are ways to get people to at least give you advice. I mean, there are many conferences where agents make themselves available all day long to talk to writers. So, it's not as bad as it used to be. But those are, that's my advice. Be a first-rate version of yourself and don't chase the market.
Yeah, that's great advice.
I
Well, it's
appreciate
about
your
time to wrap it up. Rick, did you have anything else?
No, I just want to thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Did we get all the questions?
Yeah, I
Um,
think we covered them pretty well. Some of
We
them sort of
did.
overlapped with what you shared, so I think we got them.
I have to say, do we have a minute or two?
Well, we have as
I
long
have to
as you-
say, okay, Rambo got his name from an apple. My wife, God bless her, in 1968, and I didn't have a name for the character. And he does not have a first name in the novel. He's only Rambo. And my wife I didn't have a name, and I knew it had to have the sound of force. And we had no money. She had a quarter to go buy whatever. So she came home with some apples that she bought at a roadside stand. And I remember it was a Saturday afternoon. We had one bedroom for my wife and I and our baby daughter, and my desk to write on, which was not much of a desk, and a manual typewriter. And I kept leaving the name blank. She came in, she said, I bought some apples at this roadside stand. They're pretty good. You should eat one. Yeah, I'm working, go away. No, you should eat. I love it. You should eat the apple. And all that mythic overtones. And so finally I said, all right. So I bit into the apple, and I did what everybody says when they bite into an apple that tastes pretty good. You say, that tastes pretty good. What's it called? And she said, it's a Rambo apple. And I said, what? How do you spell it? Rambo. Now, the Rambo apple is very popular in central Pennsylvania and was the apple that Johnny Appleseed, whose real name was John Chapman, planted in Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania in the mid 1800s. So it's got an American background. Now, people sometimes say, oh, well, it came from an apple. The point, whenever I tell this story, the point of the story is you never know where you're going to get an idea. And we're all, the rest of the world are amateurs and we are professionals. And our job is to pay attention to everything. So if your wife says, eat an apple, and you bite into it and it tastes good and you say, what's it called? And somebody says it's a Rambo apple, seize the opportunity. And you know that in our lives too, this happens to me and I hate it. When something will really interest me, I say, oh, that's interesting. And then I forget. Because if something interests me, I should be writing it down. I should be paying attention because it's why does it interest me? And when I start asking that question, that's the road to a story. So it's funny to talk about Rambo and the apple, but there's a profound subtext to it that we do not have the luxury of being lazy. We do not have the luxury of just letting shit go past us, when instead we should be paying attention and just sucking everything we can and shoving it into our work. So I think, that might be kind of a fun way to end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that was so fantastic. We have so many people thanking you on the chat, and I just want to thank you so much for coming and taking this time to speak to veterans and giving us these amazing tidbits, as you said, not just for writing, but for life, like how to live an authentic, wonderful, fruit-bearing life.
If they don't go together, what's the point?
Yeah.
And another time we're going to talk about Iraq and the USO, but that's maybe another topic for a conversation.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Rick, for putting this together.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted to say, I think you should write a kid's book called Rambo and the Apple.
Yeah.
Jack and the Beanstalk, Rambo and the Apple.
Yeah.
Retired Rambo plants apple seeds and has a nursery.
There you go. Right, little Rambos, right?
Rambo, yeah. Great grandchild Rambos.
Great, great.
All right. Well, thanks again, David. I look forward to.
All right. Well, God
talking to you
bless
tomorrow.
everybody and stay safe.
Thank you.
Um,
You too.
David
know,
is on.
And be
David is
kind to one
on-
another.
Yep. And David is on Twitter if you want to follow him.
And we are
And
gonna be sending out a survey, so everybody please fill that out, and then we will pass on your thanks on to David.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great night. God bless you.
Good night.
Right. Thanks, everybody.